The SRI techniques start with seed selection. Only the good seeds are used. But how do you know which seeds are best? Basically, the best seeds are the densest seeds. These will grow the strongest. Start by dissolving 150 grams of salt into a litre of water in a bucket. Add in a handful of seed. The seed which floats is no good and can be skimmed off the top and thrown away. The seed which sinks is denser and is more likely to grow a healthy, strong plant. The rest of the technique for growing seedlings is basically the same as you have been previously doing. But let us recap with some basic common sense rules. Establish a seedling nursery on the highest point of your land. It should be predominantly dry, but with easy access to water as required. Lots of compost should be used in the nursery preparation for maximum seedling growth. Sow the seedlings further apart than you would normally. This will allow for easier transplanting and separation of the small seedlings later. Seed beds should be covered by large plant leaves such as banana leaves to allow the seeds to germinate in relative shade. The planting land should also be carefully prepared. The field is ploughed and compost added. After this, it is raked flat and consistent, just as you normally do. A further technique is to draw a grid on the land at the same time with your rake. More on the reasons for this later. The first main principle to SRI is that the vigorous growth of roots is the key to the plant thriving. Good soil and water conditions, as well as good spacing, allow roots to grow large, deep and strong, giving the plant access to more nutrients and a greater variety of nutrients. But how do you improve the root growth? A number of practices help. Farmers traditionally have transplanted 20 to 30-day-old seedlings into their fields because they think they are more likely to survive. In fact, older seedlings have lost much of their potential for the vigorous growth of tillers and of roots. With the SRI techniques, we transplant seedlings at a very young age, preferably only 8 to 10 days old. These tiny seedlings have just 2 leaves and look very fragile. But if handled carefully and other techniques followed, they have the potential to grow and produce 50 to 60 tillers per plant. The transplant process must be done carefully. The tiny seedlings must be lifted out of the nursery using a trowel or piece of steel as shown here, keeping as much soil attached to the roots as possible. This is to keep the seed sacs attached to the roots. The seed sacs contain nutrients the seedling needs to grow in its early life. When planting, note how the base of the seedling is gently pinched so as to keep the soil attached as it is pulled away from the clump. It is then put carefully into the soil. With careful transplanting, virtually all plants will survive and will quickly resume their growth. Another big change is that seedlings are planted singularly, or at most 2 plants per mound. Not 3 or 4 or more plants as has been the practice. The principle behind this is where more than 2 plants are grouped together, the roots compete for nutrients. The result is a number of substandard plants where 1 thriving plant could be. So use only 1 plant. You can always save a few spare plants in your seedling nursery to replace the small percentage that might not survive planting. This is a mature field of plants grown singularly. Note how the individual plant has much more tillers and bigger tillers than this clump grown together. Another big change in technique is the spacing between plants. Remember that grid marked earlier? We would encourage you to start planting in a grid pattern with a 25 centimetre spacing between plants. By spacing the plants out more than traditionally, the plants no longer compete with each other for nutrients, and the roots grow deep and strong. The result is again a stronger, healthier plant with more tillers and better root structure, leading to greater yield per hectare. Over time, this grid pattern can be increased to 30 or 40 or even 50 centimetres apart. In Madagascar, 4 plants per square metre is being used, but only after years of SRI use on these fields. The reason for this is that after a few years of SRI, the amount of nutrients in the soils actually increases. The second main principle is that the plant needs well-aerated soil, at least during its period of vegetative growth, not flooded fields as we traditionally have done. This is perhaps the most radical departure from traditional techniques. Rice fields are not flooded during the growing season. Instead, they are simply kept moist. This allows the soil to remain aerated so that oxygen and nitrogen can get around the roots. The principles behind this are simple. Rice, like any other plant, needs to breathe. If there is a layer of water, then this cuts the root off from oxygen that is needed for the root to grow and remain healthy. When rice plants are grown in flooded fields, their roots start to disintegrate and form air pockets that permit some oxygen to get into the tissues and survive. But the root structure is comparatively weak and unhealthy, as around 3/4 of the root has died by the time the plant begins flowering and starts forming grains. Because rice is a hardy plant, it can survive standing in water, but it doesn't thrive. Plants grow much better in well-drained fields. Water management is recommended. By applying small amounts of water once a day, the soil is kept moist, not saturated. If water is applied in the evening, any excess still standing in the field in the morning should be drained off, so the soil is open to the oxygen in the air and the warmth of the sun. Also, several times during the growing period, the field should be left unwatered for 3 to 6 days, so that the soil dries out until surface cracking starts to occur. Later, when the flowering begins, a thin layer of water, 1 to 2 centimetres deep, is kept over the field until 10 to 15 days before harvesting. At this time, the field is drained and kept dry until the grain ripens. There is another method of water management that requires less labour and gives good results. This method is to alternatively flood the fields and then to drain and dry the field for alternate periods of 3 to 6 days. You should use your judgment on the length of time for rotation, but work on the basic principles of keeping the soil moist but not saturated, so the roots are not deprived of oxygen for very long. A week of flooding is probably all the roots can tolerate before damage sets in. This is one of the most radical departures from your normal methods of growing rice, but trust us, it does work.